Mentioned in the offseason, it could even be tougher because players aren't together. As if this tragedy were to happen during the season, it might be a little bit different in terms of the team being able to bond together. What role does the front office have and play into a tragedy like this?
I think it's significant. We saw the first move that Dayton Moore, the general manager, made. One of the first phone calls he made was to Mike Hill, president of baseball operations for the Miami Marlins, because there's no textbook, right? There's no manual, the GM manual that doesn't say this is what you do in a tragedy. And so the Marlins, I think did a tremendous job in dealing with the Jose Fernandez situation. It's a bit more complicated, as we said, in the offseason. But I think that the healing process, the grieving process is going to be critical. And it's different for every player. You can't assume anything. And so what I would do is I would send out my trainers regionally to meet with all of my players, and with the trainers, send an employee assistance director with them and bring players in, check and gauge where they are with their offseason conditioning, but more importantly, check and see where they are emotionally. Gather some information, help maybe in that grieving process, and then come spring training, you have to talk about it. You have to share thoughts about it. There's going to have to be moments, because during the course of a season, there will be so many different things that crop up that are reminders of Yordano Ventura, of the loss that has taken place. And to not talk about it, I think, is the wrong thing to do. The more that players can share what they're feeling, and they can understand that they're not alone, that other people are sharing those same thoughts, it'll take away the energy and the power from that. And so I think there's a big responsibility for the organization that you cannot assume anything about your players, and you need to take the lead in giving them the resources to be able to work through this grieving process.
Hey, Steve, we've been talking a lot about Yordano Ventura. Also, Andy Marte, as we mentioned, also died in a car crash, a separate car accident in the Dominican Republic yesterday. What do you remember about Marte?
Well, he was an extraordinary young talent. I think back in 2004, after the season, he was ranked the 9th best prospect in baseball. There were a lot of expectations he'd end up being a corner infielder. Got traded from the Braves to the Red Sox, then the Indians. Had his best chance of playing time with the Indians, and the offense never really came around. But this was a guy who had a chance to be a power hitter. And despite the fact that his ceiling was never reached, that he never really fulfilled that potential, this was a guy that was going to be a baseball lifer. He was grinding out a career, fighting to get back to the major leagues. Got 16 more at-bats with the Arizona Diamondbacks, and ironically, his last game in the major leagues was against the Kansas City Royals when Yordano Ventura pitched in that game. He had played the last 2 years in Korea. And the other part of this is there are a whole other group of players out there that played with Andy Marte that don't have that sort of centralized group to help them in the grieving process. And so I think that there are going to be some other players that are going to need some help in kind of working through all of this to gain some perspective. Listen, it gives us all a sense of our own mortality, makes us put in perspective some of those things that we sometimes make important that really aren't all that important. And I think it probably makes sense for every organization to take this as an opportunity to share thoughts and feelings about it, but also education as much as possible.
Mm-hmm. All right. Great thoughts as always, Steve. We appreciate that. Next time we have you on, we'll talk about much more pleasant topics here, but we really appreciate your insight into how a front office executive, general managers approach these unfortunate situations, which lately all too frequent. But thank you, Steve, as always.
Thanks.